In the heat of the courtroom, emotions swirled through the heavy air, a thick tension hanging over every word spoken. One figure, long known for poise and presence, could no longer contain the internal storm brewing within. The words hurled by an outspoken critic struck deep, crafted not simply as political jabs, but as personal attacks meant to provoke, belittle, and humiliate. Every sentence, laced with venom, challenged not just actions, but very character and legacy. The pressure built slowly at first, a clenching jaw here, a tightening grip on the chair there. But as the criticisms grew sharper, the dam finally broke. The moment wasn't theatrical. It wasn't calculated. It was raw humanity on full display. Eyewitnesses could barely believe what they were seeing. Voice cracking, face flushed with anger and sadness, the defenses crumbled. A towering figure once seen as untouchable was now visibly shaking, struggling to find breath between fractured sentences. Words failed as emotion flooded in, overpowering the courtroom's sterile procedure. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing up against the humiliation, the betrayal, the overwhelming weight of years spent building something that was now being casually torn apart in public. The audience, a mix of journalists, court officials, and casual spectators, fell silent, captivated by the scene unfolding before them. Cameras that were supposed to remain neutral seemed to lean, in desperate to capture the human moment, a man, stripped of reputation, standing exposed before the world. Some who had entered the room with skepticism or cynicism found themselves unable to look away, watching not an actor or a public figure, but a person forced to confront brutal words without the armor of fame or fortune. Each attempt to compose himself was a battle. Breaths were drawn in sharp and shallow, hands wiped furiously at eyes that betrayed every effort at stoicism. It was the purest kind of breakdown, not for show, not for sympathy, but because the emotional dam could no longer withstand the relentless battering it had endured. Lawyers exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the eruption continue. Opposing counsel, sensing the vulnerability, seemed caught between strategic advantage and human discomfort. Some of the harshest comments weren't just criticisms of public actions, but cut at personal integrity, at deep values held close over a lifetime. Being portrayed as a caricature, as a villain in a story crafted by political enemies, was more than an insult. It was a distortion of truth, a rewriting of a personal and professional history that had been hard-fought and passionately lived. The sense of injustice was almost tangible, radiating from every shaking movement and every broken word. Meanwhile, across the room, some faces remained stone-cold, indifferent to the emotional collapse taking place before them. In their eyes, it was a weakness to be exploited, a crack in the armor they had so eagerly been chipping away at. But for others, even those who might have disagreed with the figure's politics or public stances, there was an undeniable human resonance in the moment. It was a reminder that beyond headlines and talking points, there are still individuals who bleed, break, and bear wounds invisible to the public eye. The judge, sitting high above the fray, maintained a professional facade, but occasionally glanced down with a mixture of concern and restraint. This wasn't a part of the process that any courtroom manual could prepare for. It was the collision of law and human frailty, and the sterile, controlled environment of the court felt almost too fragile to contain the rawness bursting forth. No prepared statements, no rehearsed speeches, no polished publicist-driven responses could have captured the sheer authenticity of the collapse. It was painful, uncomfortable, and yet profoundly real. A life spent mastering words, appearances, and performances was, for this brief and brutal window of time, stripped down to its bare, trembling core. There was no winning this moment, no strategic recovery or spin. The only thing left was the truth of what it felt like to be battered by a world that no longer cared to understand, only to judge. In that courtroom, under the brutal glare of the public spotlight, the mask fell away completely. What remained was not a headline, not a brand, not a persona, just a battered soul fighting to reclaim a shred of dignity in a world that had, for the moment, decided he was easier to mock than to understand. The courtroom, already thick with tension, shifted palpably when a large stack of documents was produced with deliberate care. There was an audible shift among the crowd, a collective leaning forward, a drawing in of breath, as the evidence, previously unseen and unexpected, was introduced into the record. These weren't just casual notes or vague references. They were cold, hard receipts, organized meticulously, each page threatening to upend the narrative that had been so confidently spun by opponents. Every paper, every printed message, every time-stamped communication was a weapon. For weeks, if not months, accusations had been flung with reckless abandon, painting a picture that suited a certain agenda. The story had been told and retold so many times that it had begun to harden into something resembling fact. But this new cache of evidence cracked that illusion wide open, exposing gaps, inconsistencies, and outright fabrications. The legal team, with an almost theatrical precision, began walking the court through each key piece. Emails showed conversations previously denied. Financial documents revealed truths that had been spun into lies. Screenshots of private exchanges illuminated a version of events far different from the one broadcast on talk shows and social media. The cold reality of evidence and emotionless unyielding had a devastating effect. Every highlighted paragraph, every circled date, stripped away the comforting fog of speculation, replacing it with undeniable reality. Spectators, including seasoned reporters who thought they had seen it all, began whispering among themselves. Journalists scribbled frantically, recognizing the moment for what it was, a turning point that few had anticipated. This wasn't simply a rebuttal. It was a strategic demolition of an entire narrative carefully constructed to tear a person down. Instead of relying on fiery speeches or emotional appeals, the strategy was ruthless in its simplicity. Let the truth in black and white do the talking. Opposing counsel who had spent so much energy framing the case around public perception visibly shifted in their seats. Their earlier confidence seemed to wilt under the weight of undeniable facts. They tried to object, to slow the momentum, but the judge, sensing the significance of the evidence, allowed the process to unfold. There was no grandstanding, no shouting, just the slow, methodical unveiling of reality, page after damning page. Each document felt like a strike against the brittle armor of deception. Claims that had once seemed plausible now looked absurd when juxtaposed against actual records. Statements that had once generated applause or outrage on partisan platforms crumbled under the cold scrutiny of evidence. The contrast was staggering. The loud accusations of weeks past versus the silent, crushing weight of the truth now on full display. Even those aligned with the opposition could no longer deny the power of the evidence laid bare before them. In a space where spin and half-truths often ruled the day, the emergence of hard facts created an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning. The courtroom no longer belonged to those who shouted the loudest. It belonged to those who could prove what they claimed. Every detail mattered. It wasn't just the content of the documents, but their authenticity, their careful organization, their irrefutable connection to the events in question. No tricks, no smoke and mirrors, just reality, laid out in a way that demanded to be acknowledged. The audience wasn't just witnessing a defense. They were witnessing a dismantling, a quiet but merciless deconstruction of a false story that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. Throughout the process, the atmosphere remained electric. Every new revelation tightened the noose around the lies that had been so casually disseminated before. Allies who had once cheered from the sidelines now found themselves silent, confronted with proof that could not be argued away with clever talking points or emotional manipulation. The air grew heavier with each document presented, a silent understanding passing through the room. The ground was shifting beneath their feet. It became increasingly clear that the attempt to destroy a reputation wasn't just misguided. It was built on a foundation of distortions, exaggerations, and deliberate omissions that could not withstand serious scrutiny. This wasn't just a legal strategy. It was a masterclass in the power of preparation, patience, and truth. In a world that often rewards volume over veracity, the presentation of undeniable receipts cut through the noise with a blade of cold clarity. Facts were placed above feelings, evidence above ego, and reality above reputation. The moment of confrontation had been building slowly, a simmering tension just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. For days, the courtroom had been a battleground of words and strategies, with accusations flying fast and loose. At the center of it all stood the figure who had delivered the most cutting blows, someone whose remarks had ignited a firestorm, their words dripping with a certain ruthless calculation. The decision to finally call out those remarks directly wasn't made lightly. It was a tactical move, but it was also deeply personal, driven by a need to challenge the spread of falsehoods and protect what had been unjustly tarnished. The remarks themselves weren't casual criticisms. They were sharp, brutal, and deeply personal attacks. They hadn't targeted policy or projects or work. They had struck at character, at personal values, at the very core of a person's identity. They were designed not to critique but to humiliate, not to debate but to destroy. In this arena, where image and reputation were as much at stake as legal outcomes, such remarks carried the power to redefine public perception almost instantly. When the legal team rose to address these comments, the shift in tone was immediate. There was no hesitation, no half measures. They named the attacks for what they were: malicious lies, carefully crafted to tear down, to delegitimize, and to poison the well of public opinion. They spoke with a calm intensity that left little room for misunderstanding. Every word was chosen with precision, laying out how these remarks had twisted reality and weaponized it for personal and political gain. The court listened in near total silence, the usual murmur of side conversations and paper shuffling completely absent. The accusation wasn't just that the remarks had been cruel, it was that they had been knowingly false, a deliberate attempt to smear someone's name without regard for truth or consequence. It wasn't about heated emotions or political disagreement. It was about the line between fair criticism and outright character assassination being crossed without hesitation. Evidence was cited meticulously. Past interviews were quoted, private communications were referenced, timelines were mapped out to show exactly how the misleading narrative had been constructed. It was an unmasking, a moment when the veneer of political bravado was peeled away, to reveal the cold, calculated cruelty beneath. The words that had once seemed spontaneous and impassioned were shown to be part of a larger strategy, a strategy built on misrepresentation and personal destruction. Observers who had come into the courtroom expecting another day of procedural posturing now found themselves witnessing a far more gripping drama. Journalists, sensing the gravity of the moment, scribbled notes furiously. Some leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that what was happening wasn't just legal maneuvering, it was a direct challenge to the culture of casual slander that had infected so much of public discourse. The person whose remarks were being called out sat quietly, showing little reaction on the surface. But the tension was visible, a stiffness in posture, a slight narrowing of the eyes. The impact of being publicly named and challenged could not be easily shrugged off. Once accusations are laid bare under the harsh light of truth, they lose their power, and those who spread them must reckon with the consequences. There was a righteousness to the moment, a sense that finally, someone was refusing to accept the erosion of truth as just another part of the game. It wasn't about scoring points or winning a news cycle. It was about standing up against a tide of cynicism and cruelty that had gone unchallenged for too long. In an age when so much could be destroyed with a single viral clip or a cutting headline, this stand for integrity felt almost radical. The atmosphere remained heavy as the courtroom digested what had been said. This wasn't just a defense against slander, it was a broader indictment of a system that too often rewards the loudest and the most vicious, rather than the most honest. The challenge laid down was clear. Lies would not be allowed to stand. Unopposed, reputations would not be allowed to be shredded without a fight. The call-out didn't rely on anger or theatrics. It relied on facts, clarity, and moral authority. It reminded everyone watching, inside the courtroom and beyond its walls, that words matter, that truth matters, and that attacking someone's character with deliberate falsehoods is not just cruel, it is deeply wrong. In that moment, the court became not just a place of legal reckoning, but a place where accountability was finally, forcefully demanded. What had first seemed like a singular courtroom drama began to reveal a deeper, more unsettling undercurrent. As the proceedings unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the case was never just about one person's reputation or grievances. The atmosphere shifted noticeably as connections were drawn, names were dropped, and implications were hinted at without always being spoken aloud. It was as though the walls of the courtroom couldn't contain the full weight of what was being uncovered. What started as a character dispute now looked suspiciously like a piece of a much larger and far more intricate puzzle. Throughout the testimonies and presentations, patterns began to emerge. The attacks hadn't appeared in isolation. They followed a script, a choreography of narratives repeated across certain platforms and voices with uncanny precision. Articles, television segments, social media posts, all pushing remarkably similar talking points, almost as if orchestrated from somewhere behind the scenes. It no longer seemed plausible that the situation had evolved naturally. Instead, it hinted at a coordinated effort, a campaign where personal destruction was simply the first move on a larger chessboard. The courtroom's participants seemed aware of the deeper implications, even if few dared to voice them directly. When documents were presented showing coordinated communications between multiple parties, individuals who outwardly had no reason to be linked, an uneasy murmur ran through the spectators. Legal teams tread carefully, mindful that to fully expose what they suspected would require more than just evidence. It would require courage, because the entities involved hinted at influence far beyond the courtroom's immediate reach. Each new revelation peeled back another layer, suggesting that reputations were expendable in a larger, calculated game of power. Character assassinations, media manipulation, and strategic leaks weren't rogue actions of an angry critic. They were tools wielded by figures with clear goals and little regard for collateral damage. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal battles, but for glimpses into a machinery few ever see up close, a machinery that moves quietly, relentlessly shaping narratives behind the scenes. The weight of these possibilities pressed down on the proceedings, altering how every new piece of information was received. Witnesses, once eager to speak, grew noticeably more cautious. Testimonies became less confident as questions touched upon communications or affiliations that had previously been shielded from scrutiny. There was a tangible fear of pulling too hard on threads that could unravel alliances powerful enough to make life extremely difficult for those who dared. In the gallery, those who had come to witness a simple dispute began to realize they were seeing something bigger than personal grievances. This was about systems of control, about how public opinion is manufactured, about how dissent is punished and inconvenient voices are drowned out. The chilling part wasn't just that this machinery existed. It was how seamless, how efficient, and how invisible it usually remained unless dragged kicking and screaming into the light. Those seeking justice found themselves navigating not just legal complexities but a labyrinth of influence networks where media narratives, political ambitions, and financial interests intertwined seamlessly. It raised uncomfortable questions. How many public figures had been quietly destroyed in similar ways? How many careers, reputations, and even personal lives had been crushed not by public opinion organically formed, but by invisible hands steering? Outrage for their own benefit? Even without direct accusations being formally made, the implications hovered in every corner of the courtroom like a thick mist. Observers exchanged wary glances, sensing that the forces at work were far bigger than they had imagined when they first entered. Legal strategies shifted subtly, recognizing that fighting a personal attack was one thing, but standing against a powerful, coordinated machine required something altogether different. The proceedings exposed the fragility of truth when confronted by resources, influence, and relentless propaganda. It showed how easily the line between reality and fiction can be blurred when narratives are built methodically, funded generously, and deployed ruthlessly. What was being defended wasn't just one person's honor, it was the idea that truth itself could still matter in a world increasingly indifferent to it. In this new light, the personal battle that had sparked the courtroom drama became almost symbolic. It was no longer just a defense against falsehood. It was a stand against an entire culture that treats lies as acceptable tools and sees truth as expendable in the pursuit of dominance. What had started as an individual struggle had expanded into a fight against something much larger, much colder, and far more dangerous. In the final moments of the proceedings, a profound stillness settled over the room, as if everyone present recognized they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple legal battle. The faces of the attendees, reporters, court staff, casual observers, reflected the weight of what had unfolded. This was no longer just about settling scores or clearing a name. It had grown into a testament to how fragile the concepts of truth, reputation, and justice can be when targeted by systems larger and more ruthless than any individual. What lingered wasn't just the memory of emotional testimony or the presentation of damning evidence. It was the realization that public narratives are not always born from public sentiment. Often they are crafted carefully in back rooms, amplified by willing participants, and fed to a populace too overwhelmed or distracted to question their origins. The battle fought inside the courtroom was emblematic of a greater cultural decay, a world where lies travel faster than truth, where integrity is a weakness to be exploited rather than a value to be honored. Through it all, there was no guarantee of redemption or restoration. The scars left by character assassination run deep, and no number of legal victories can fully undo the damage inflicted when reputations are shredded in the public square. But there was still a kind of triumph in standing firm, in refusing to be erased and confronting those who believed they could destroy without consequence. Courage had been shown not only in the evidence presented, but in the refusal to bow to intimidation or despair. As the final arguments closed and the court prepared to adjourn, the sense of unfinished business hung heavily in the air. Justice. In a courtroom is one thing. Justice in the court of public opinion is another beast entirely. But the message sent was unmistakable. The forces that trade in lies and manipulation are not invincible. They can be challenged. They can be exposed. And when faced with truth, even the most carefully constructed facades can begin to crack. The story that would leave the courtroom and enter the broader world would be complicated, messy, and fiercely contested. Narratives would clash. Spin would be applied. But those who had witnessed the full picture, those who had seen not just the headlines but the human cost beneath them, would carry a deeper understanding of the stakes involved. In the end, the proceedings were not just about winning a case. They were about drawing a line in the sand. They were about declaring that dignity, truth, and the right to defend oneself against coordinated destruction still matter, even in a world increasingly willing to forget. And though the battle may continue beyond the courtroom's walls, a crucial stand had been made, one that would not be so easy.